Thousands of Americans live in towns that don't officially exist anymore. Their mail gets delivered to places that aren't supposed to be there. How is this possible? Deep in the mountains of Appalachia, something incredible was happening during the 1800s. Families were carving out lives in places most people would consider impossible to live. We're talking about steep hillsides, narrow valleys, and forests so thick you could barely see the sky. These weren't your typical American settlers looking for easy farmland. These folks found beauty in isolation. They'd build their homes wherever they could find a flat spot big enough for a cabin and maybe a small garden. Distance between neighbors? Well, your closest friend might live 3 miles away through rough terrain that would make a mountain goat nervous. But here's what made these communities special. They figured out how to thrive anyway. Families became experts at reading the land. They knew which slopes got the best sun for corn, where to find the sweetest water, and how to raise livestock on terrain that looked impossible for farming. Makes sense, right? When you're isolated, you either learn fast or you don't survive. Then the railroad started snaking through some valleys in the late 1800s. This changed everything for certain areas. Suddenly, towns that had been cut off from the world could ship out timber, coal, and crops. Some communities exploded almost overnight as the outside world discovered what was hidden in these mountains. The weird part is how selective this railroad boom was. One valley might get connected to major cities and start bustling with activity, while the next valley over, maybe just a few miles away, remained as isolated as ever. Geography determined everything. If the railroad engineers couldn't figure out how to blast through your particular mountain, your town stayed forgotten. Life remained brutally hard regardless of railroad access. Winters could trap families for months. Medical emergencies often became life or death situations simply because help was too far away. Yet these communities developed something remarkable: bonds stronger than steel. When someone needed help, neighbors would travel for hours just to lend a hand. Let's not forget how resourceful these mountain folks became. They created their own entertainment, their own justice systems, and their own ways of handling problems. Every family had skills that kept the whole community functioning. One family might be known for their healing remedies, another for their ability to fix anything mechanical. By the early 1900s, many of these settlements had grown into proper small towns. They built one-room schoolhouses, where kids of all ages learned together. Churches became the heart of social life, not just for worship, but for community meetings, celebrations, and sometimes heated debates about local issues. Post offices connected them to the wider world, even if mail only arrived once a week. These mountain communities had created something unique in American history. They'd built functioning societies in places where most people said civilization couldn't exist. They had their own culture, their own traditions, and most importantly, their own deep connection to the land they called home. But powerful forces were already looking at these same mountains with very different plans in mind. The mountains looked different in 1911. Not because the peaks had moved or the trees had changed color, but because someone in Washington, D.C. had decided these ancient hills needed saving. From what, exactly? Well, that's where things get interesting. Congress passed something called the Weeks Act that year. Sounds boring, right? Most laws do. But this particular piece of paper gave the federal government permission to buy up massive chunks of forest land across America. The official reason was conservation, protecting trees, wildlife, and watersheds for future generations. Noble goals, sure. The problem was that thousands of families were already living on that land. Mountain communities that had existed for generations suddenly found themselves in the crosshairs of progress. Government agents started showing up with surveys and legal documents, measuring property lines and calculating how much it would cost to make entire towns disappear. The bureaucrats called it land acquisition for the public good. The families being forced out had different words for it. Then came the national parks. Shenandoah National Park in Virginia displaced over 2,000 people from their homes. Great Smoky Mountains National Park wiped out entire settlements that had stood since before the Civil War. These weren't empty wilderness areas, they were working communities with schools, churches, and post offices. But the government had decided that tourists and conservation mattered more than the people who had called these mountains home for decades. The Tennessee Valley Authority made things even worse. This New Deal program built dams across the region, creating jobs and electricity for growing cities. Sounds great until you realize what happens when you dam a river. Valleys flood, towns vanish under hundreds of feet of water. Entire communities got permanent swimming pools, whether they wanted them or not. Let's not forget the twisted logic behind these decisions. Officials argued that removing mountain families would actually help them. Life was hard in the hills. They said people were isolated and poor. Moving them to modern towns with better opportunities was really a favor. Never mind that many families had been thriving in these mountains for generations, developing their own ways of surviving and building close-knit communities. The government also claimed these lands for natural resource extraction and recreational use. Mining companies wanted the coal and minerals buried in the hills. City dwellers wanted scenic vacation spots. Both groups had more political power than the mountain families standing in their way. Most families discovered they had little legal recourse to fight these removals. The government offered compensation, but it was usually far below what the land was actually worth to the people living there. Some tried to resist through the courts. Others simply packed up and left when the bulldozers arrived. A few held out until the very end, becoming legends in their own communities. But here's what really happened when the government trucks rolled away and the dust settled. The displaced families didn't just lose their homes, they lost something much harder to replace. Their stories, their connections to the land, their entire way of life started disappearing too. The numbers tell a brutal story, but the human cost cuts deeper. Over 2,000 people got kicked out just for Shenandoah National Park alone. That's an entire community scattered to the wind like leaves in a storm. Families who had lived on the same land for generations suddenly found themselves packing up everything they owned. Well, everything they could carry anyway. The government didn't exactly give people time to plan elaborate moving sales. Most families had to abandon furniture, tools, and anything too heavy to haul. But here's the really heartbreaking part. They also had to leave behind their dead. Graveyards got swallowed up by the new parkland, turning final resting places into hiking trails. Some families tried to move their relatives' remains, but many graves were simply left to disappear under growing forests. Towns with names like Proctor, Tremont, and Lewiston vanished overnight. These weren't tiny settlements either. Proctor had a thriving lumber mill, houses, a school, and a real community feel. Tremont boasted a hotel and several businesses. Lewiston sat in a fertile valley where families had farmed for decades. Today, you won't find them on any map. They exist only in faded photographs and the memories of people getting older each year. Then there's the water situation, which gets even more twisted. When the Tennessee Valley Authority decided they needed dams and lakes, entire valleys got flooded. Imagine watching your childhood home slowly disappear under rising water. That's exactly what happened to hundreds of families. Their houses, churches, and corner stores now sit at the bottom of man-made lakes, like some kind of underwater ghost town. The stories people tell about leaving are filled with raw emotion that still stings today. Many describe feeling completely powerless against the government machine. One elderly woman remembered her grandmother crying for weeks, not because of the house they lost, but because she couldn't take her flower garden. Another man recalled his father standing silent for hours, just staring at the family cemetery they'd have to abandon. What makes these memories even more painful is how sudden everything happened. Families thought they had rights, that their land meant something. They quickly learned otherwise. The government offered compensation, sure, but try putting a price on generations of family history. Most payments barely covered moving expenses, let alone starting over somewhere completely new. Local legends keep these vanished places breathing somehow. Old-timers still swap stories about the best fishing spots now underwater, or the general store where everyone gathered on Saturday nights. Kids grow up hearing about great-grandparents' farms that tourists now hike across without knowing they're walking through someone's former backyard. The weird part is how completely these places disappeared. It's not like they became ruins you can visit. They got erased so thoroughly that most people today have no idea they ever existed. But the memories refuse to die, passed down like family heirlooms from one generation to the next. The government didn't just move people. They rewrote the very landscape itself. And that's where things get really interesting. When the government decided these mountain towns had to go, they didn't just move people out. They went one step further. Complete erasure. Picture opening a map from 1900, then comparing it to one from 1950, entire communities that existed for generations, gone. Not marked as former or historical site, just empty space where families once called home. The cartographers redrew reality with their pens, and suddenly places like Proctor, Tennessee, and dozens of Virginia mountain settlements never existed at all. But here's where it gets really cold. The post offices shut down first. That meant no more mail delivery, no more official address. Try explaining to your relatives in the city that your town doesn't have a zip code anymore because it's about to become a lake bottom. Then came the road signs. Workers pulled them up and tossed them aside like old fence posts. The physical destruction came next, and it was thorough. Historic log cabins that survived the Civil War, bulldozed or left to rot underwater. Churches where 3 generations got married, demolished before the flooding began. Some buildings were so well built that dynamite was the only option. Makes you wonder what stories those walls could have told. Then there's the bureaucratic magic trick that really seals the deal. Government agencies updated every official record, survey map, and land document. Property deeds became worthless paper. Birth certificates listed hometowns that technically no longer existed. Veterans returning from World War II discovered their childhood addresses had been scrubbed from reality. Well, not completely scrubbed. Some county clerks kept the old records tucked away in filing cabinets. A few state historians made copies before everything disappeared. But finding these documents today requires serious detective work and a lot of luck. The Tennessee Valley Authority was particularly efficient at this vanishing act. When they flooded Lewiston, Tennessee for Norris Lake, they didn't just drown the buildings. They relocated the cemetery, renamed the surrounding area, and updated every map within 100 miles. The town became a footnote in a government report, nothing more. And the weird part is how quickly people adapted to the new geography. Within a decade, even locals started forgetting exactly where these towns used to sit. New residents moved to the area and never knew they were living above what used to be someone's main street. Some of the erased towns had been around longer than many major American cities. They had their own post offices, general stores, one-room schools, and tight-knit communities. All of that history compressed into a single line item in a federal budget proposal. But maps tell only part of the story. Records can be hidden or destroyed, addresses can disappear, and government officials can pretend places never mattered. What they couldn't erase so easily were the people who remembered. The families who carried stories, the children who grew up hearing about the old days, the neighbors who refused to forget. Those memories would prove harder to drown than any building. They would reshape how an entire region saw itself and its relationship with the outside world. When the government carved up Appalachian communities, they didn't just move people. They rewrote the entire story of who these mountains belonged to. Before the forced removals, Appalachia meant families who'd lived on the same land for generations. It meant knowing every creek, every ridge, every neighbor for miles around. Then suddenly, the mountains became something else entirely, playgrounds for city folks and symbols of untouched wilderness. Never mind that families had been touching, shaping, and caring for this land for over a century. The national parks brought a flood of tourists with cameras and hiking boots. These visitors saw pristine forests and scenic overlooks, not the ghost towns buried beneath their feet. Park brochures talked about preserving nature while completely ignoring the human communities that had been part of that nature. Makes sense, right? It's easier to sell a romantic wilderness story than explain why you bulldoze someone's hometown. Well, here's where it gets interesting. The government's version of Appalachia started sticking. Suddenly, the region became known for 2 things: poverty and natural beauty. The complex reality of thriving mountain communities got squeezed into a much simpler narrative. Either you were a backward hillbilly who needed saving, or you were an obstacle to progress that needed removing. Let's not forget how the new maps literally redrew identity. County lines shifted when valleys flooded. State borders moved when parks expanded. Towns that had been regional centers for decades simply vanished from official records. If you can't find a place on a map, did it ever really exist? The government was betting on no. Then there's the economic transformation that nobody talks about. These weren't just sleepy mountain villages getting a tourism upgrade. Many of the erased towns had been economic hubs, places where timber, farming, and small manufacturing created real prosperity. When they disappeared, so did generations of local knowledge about sustainable mountain living. The irony? The government destroyed communities that had figured out how to thrive in these mountains, then spent decades trying to bring economic development back to the same areas. And the weird part is how this story spread beyond Appalachia. The successful erasure of these towns became a model for other regions. Need land for a military base? Just declare it essential for national security. Want to build a dam? Talk about progress and electricity for everyone. The Appalachian removals prove that entire communities could be made to disappear if you had the right combination of legal authority and public relations. But here's what the government didn't count on. The people who got forced out, they didn't just vanish along with their towns, they carried their stories, their anger, and their memories to new places. These displaced families became walking archives of what had been lost. The identity crisis created by these removals still echoes through Appalachian culture today. Every family reunion, every local history project, every argument about development brings up the same question: whose version of this region's story gets to be official? The answer to that question shaped everything that came after, and it's still being written today. Walk through any mountain valley today, and you might stumble across something strange. A crumbling stone foundation where no house should be. An old road that leads nowhere, swallowed by decades of forest growth. Maybe even a rusted mailbox standing guard over empty air. These aren't random relics, they're breadcrumbs from the towns that vanished. Finding these places takes detective work now. Your GPS won't help because officially they don't exist. But ask someone who's lived in the mountains for 70 years and watch their eyes light up. "Oh, you mean where the old Simmons place used to be?" they'll say, pointing toward what looks like ordinary woods. "My daddy worked at the mill there before the government came through." The weird part is how much stuff actually survived. Concrete steps that once led to front porches now climb toward nothing but sky. Cemetery stones peek through the underbrush, marking graves that outlasted the towns themselves. Some of these burial grounds are still maintained by families who drive hours just to tend plots in the middle of what's now wilderness. Then there are the museums fighting to keep these stories alive. The Museum of Appalachia in Tennessee displays artifacts rescued from doomed communities. Old photographs show bustling main streets where hiking trails now wind through. Makes you wonder what other pieces of history we've paved over without thinking twice, right? But here's where it gets interesting and controversial. Public debates rage about whether removing these towns was worth it. Park officials point to millions of visitors who now enjoy pristine forests and crystal-clear lakes. Tourism dollars flow into regional economies that were once dependent on failing farms and dangerous mining operations. Local families aren't buying that argument entirely. They took our heritage and turned it into a postcard, one descendant told a reporter recently. The bitterness runs deep, passed down through generations like family recipes or old quilts. Well, the influence extends beyond hurt feelings. These erasures shaped how America sees Appalachia itself. The removal stories became part of a larger narrative about backward mountain people who supposedly couldn't adapt to modern times. Never mind that many of these communities had thriving economies before the government intervened. Research groups now use satellite imagery and old surveys to map exactly where these towns stood. They're creating digital archives so future generations can understand what was lost. Some activists push for official historical markers acknowledging the displaced communities. And the weird part is how the land remembers even when the maps don't. Apple trees still bloom in clearings where farmhouses once stood, planted by hands that have been dust for decades. Springs that once supplied entire neighborhoods continue flowing, unmarked and unnamed on any current survey. The legacy lives on in family stories, faded photographs, and the occasional foundation stone. These vanished Appalachian towns remind us that progress always costs somebody something, and sometimes that somebody doesn't get to vote on whether the price is worth paying.